Hello everybody, in this video we're going to talk about cognitive dissonance theory. And before we actually get into the details of the theory itself, I think it's actually easy to understand by using the fox and the grapes fable, which you might have actually read about as a child. So right here we have this fable. It says, "Driven by hunger, a fox tried to reach some grapes hanging high on the vine, but was unable to, although he leaped with all his strength. As he went away, the fox remarked, 'Oh, you aren't even ripe yet. I don't need any sour grapes.'" All right, so what's going on here? This is an example of cognitive dissonance theory. So first, let's break it apart. The actual term cognitive dissonance is the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes. And so in the fox and the grapes fable, you have two sort of opposing ideas. The first is that the fox is hungry, and the second is that the fox cannot reach the food. It can't get to the grapes. So this incompatibility creates dissonance. And dissonance is basically just another word for anxiety or strife, stress. And so we don't like that feeling because dissonance is uncomfortable. Mentally speaking, we don't want to feel anxiety. And so the basis of this theory suggests that this uncomfortable feeling will then motivate us to reduce the dissonance in various ways. Okay, so what did the fox do? The fox convinced itself that it didn't actually want those grapes because they were probably sour. So by changing its attitude, originally it wanted the grapes, but it couldn't reach them. So therefore, by changing its attitude and convincing itself it didn't even want those grapes, that reduces the dissonance. Now it's hungry, but there's some grapes that it doesn't even want. That does not create an incompatible relationship or a dissonant relationship. All right, so basically, cognitive dissonance is where we rationalize our behaviors. We have a self-serving bias. We always want to look at ourselves positively. We want to feel like we're good people. And so when we do things, we will sort of go through these mental hurdles so that we don't experience dissonance. And this has been tested in a ton of research. Here, I just want to highlight what I feel are some of the more interesting examples that stand out over the last 50 or 60 years, starting with Leon Festinger's $1 versus $20 study. In 1957, Festinger was the researcher who actually coined the term cognitive dissonance. And his research is really, really straightforward, but really, really interesting. So here's the basic idea in his experiment. He brings volunteers into his laboratory, and he has them do a really boring task for 1 hour. The task was actually to take a pegboard and to turn each peg by a quarter turn over and over and over for an hour. So this was just a completely monotonous, boring task. It really didn't have anything to do with the study itself other than the fact that it was meant to be boring and not enjoyable. After the task is done, he says to the participants, "Will you please tell the next person in line that you actually enjoyed the study?" So regardless of how much they actually did enjoy that task, and obviously most people found it really terrible and boring, they had to go outside and say it was enjoyable. For their time, half of the participants were paid $1 and the other half of the participants were paid $20. So remember, they go outside, they tell the next individual it was an enjoyable experience, and then they go home. A week later, all of the volunteers are asked to return to the laboratory. And Festinger asked everyone individually a question. He asked them, "How much did you enjoy that experience?" And what he found was rather surprising. He actually found that the people who were paid only $1 reported enjoying the experience significantly more compared to those who were paid $20. Now, this seems rather surprising. You might be thinking, getting paid $20 in 1957, that's a lot of money. Why wouldn't those individuals report enjoying the experience more than those who got paid less? But what we have to remember is that there's got to be some dissonance involved here. So everybody had to go outside and tell the individual that they enjoyed it. So the people who got paid $20, they told us and this individual that it was enjoyable simply because of the money. But those who were only paid $1, they didn't have that same external justification. Therefore, they had to rationalize the behavior internally. They actually convinced themselves that not the money, but the task itself was enjoyable, that they actually enjoyed turning those pegs a quarter turn at a time. Why? Well, again, they had an hour of their time, and you don't want to think your time is wasted. That's going to create dissonance. So they rationalize it. They convince themselves that, I didn't waste my time. Yeah, $1 is not very much money. Who cares? I actually enjoyed that experience. In terms of real world applications, some research has found that people who volunteer for the same task as those who get paid, the volunteers will often report enjoying the task more. And why? Because you don't want to think that you volunteered for something where you wasted your time. So you have to convince yourself that you actually enjoyed that experience to reduce your dissonance. On the other hand, if you're not enjoying a task, but you're getting paid, you can rationalize why you do that thing for the money. All right. So let's look at a couple of other examples here. In 1958, Mills, he studies this with academic integrity. Basically, the study looked at students who cheat, and he basically found that students who cheat have the most favorable views towards cheating. He sets up this test where students, I think they were 5th and 6th grade students, they could only pass the exam by cheating. Some cheated, some did not. Those individuals that did cheat, they had the most favorable views towards cheating when surveyed after the actual test. Why? Well, if I cheat on an exam and I think cheating is wrong, that creates dissonance. Those are not compatible. I want to look at myself as a good person. So what do? If I cheat on an exam, I have to convince myself that cheating is not a big deal. Maybe you might say things like everybody does it or whatever. So academic integrity, you could take that to all sort of moral domains. Sort of like infidelity, for example. You might say, it's not a big deal, or everybody does it, in order to rationalize unethical or immoral behavior. The computer dating study kind of looks at this cognitive dissonance theory in a romantic setting. So in 1989, researchers, they had volunteers, and they were, all the volunteers were shown pictures of individuals, and they had to rate how attractive they thought these individuals were in the pictures. And what they found was that the people who were in committed relationships tended to rate the attractiveness of the people in these pictures lower compared to people who were single. So from a cognitive dissonance perspective, you could argue that if you're in a committed relationship, viewing somebody else as attractive is going to create dissonance. Because you're committed, and you shouldn't be looking at somebody else as a potential partner, if you will. And so in order to feel better about one's current status, you can convince yourself that those individuals are actually not attractive. In cognitive dissonance theory, you can change your behavior, you can change your attitudes, or add a bridge that actually sort of melds everything together. In other words, if you're in a committed relationship and you deem somebody attractive, you can get out of that relationship to become single. But if you're in a strongly committed relationship, another way of reducing the dissonance, according to these researchers, is to convince yourself that those other potential people are not attractive. Okay, so broad applications to cognitive dissonance theory. Let's just end on one final example known as the foot in the door technique. So this is when individuals commit themselves in a small way, the likelihood of committing themselves further is increased. In other words, if you get somebody to agree to a small favor, they're more likely to grant you a larger favor as opposed to just starting off with a large favor. So the classic Friedman and Fraser study, the Drive Safely study, what these researchers did was they went to people's houses and asked them, would you be willing to put a giant sign on your front lawn that says, please drive safely, there are children here? Most people declined. And it's not because they didn't favor safe driving. It's because they didn't really want a, gigantic sign on their front lawn. So the researchers then tried the foot in the door technique. They later on went to different houses, and they first asked these individuals, would you be willing to sign this petition stating that you are in favor of safe driving practices in our neighborhood? And not surprisingly, most people agreed because that's a small request. Of course, I'll sign your petition. Then, a week later, researchers followed up with those same houses, the ones that originally agreed to sign the petition. And then they asked, would you be willing to put a large sign on your front lawn that says, please drive safely? And what did they find? They found that compliance rates went way higher. Statistically speaking, a significant difference was found compared to when researchers simply originally asked the large favor. So what's going on here? From a cognitive dissonance standpoint, a large favor it's a burden. It's too much of a responsibility, if you will. But if you can close the gap a little bit, reduce the dissonance just a little bit by getting somebody to agree to a small request, that makes it easier to bridge the gap towards that large request. So just like the fox and the grapes, when we have incompatible ideas, when my behavior and my attitudes don't match, I need to do some sort of manipulation in order to reduce dissonance. Dissonance doesn't feel good. I want to look at myself as a good person. I want to feel like I'm right, like I'm moral. And even if I do things that might be questionable, I will sort of manipulate that in my mind. I will reduce the dissonance so that I ultimately feel better about myself. All right, so that's cognitive dissonance theory in terms of a basic definition and some research. There's so much other research out there. I really encourage you to check out some in the textbook, on the internet as well. And more importantly, start to look for this in your own life. Start to look for your own behavior. Am I reducing my dissonance in irrational ways? Because sometimes we will do things that are questionable. And ultimately, we have a self-serving bias. So sometimes this can be a bad thing, but I don't think it's always a bad thing. Cognitive dissonance allows us to move forward with, the least amount of anxiety or dissonance possible. All right, so I hope you enjoyed the video and continue on for more information in social psychology.